if you don't know Outright International, we're a 30-plus-year-old organization dedicated to better lives for LGBTIQ people globally. And the way we do our work is we have 55-something staff in 18 countries and always work in partnerships with groups in country. And the 4 ways of us doing our work is we amplify voices from around the world because we think that the world needs to hear from activists on the front lines about what LGBTIQ lives look like and what needs to be done to improve them. We advocate. That is how we change the world at the local, national, regional, and international levels. We support, because change is not going to come without our movements being able to push for that change. You can never parachute rights into another country. It always has to come through a combination of this work happening in country and with the help of an international movement helping to accelerate it. And we celebrate. We celebrate our lives, our creativity, and our wins when we can get them. OutSummit this year is focused on some of the topics that we think are the most urgent for our movements at this time. And I have to start with our panel today on trans liberation. Obviously speaks to the enormous anti-trans push that we see pretty much in every part of the world. When I started my LGBTIQ activism source 25 years ago, one of the first things that I encountered was I was at the Stockholm Pride event, and a group of lesbian feminist separatists wanted to do an event that was exclusive, that was completely excluding any trans people. The next year, we didn't allow any of that. And I was like, okay, great, like we're making progress. And I really actually naively, I mean, it was 25 years ago, so obviously, you know, I was right to be naive at that point in time in my life, I think. But, you know, I really thought that, okay, that was a thing of the past. Not that it was fixed everywhere, but I really just thought, okay, you make progress in one place, then you move on, you make progress on different issues or in different places. Obviously, I've learned since, you can never take your wins for granted. And you have to keep fighting to maintain the wins that you have made. And so we think it's a critical issue to discuss. Also, it is critical for us as we come together as global movements to discuss the issues together. Because that is what's happening. Those who want to strip us of our rights, they are learning from each other. We also have to learn from each other. That leads me to a couple of our other topics, the inclusive economies and the democracy topics. There are 40-some countries that hold elections next year. I read it on the internet, so it has to be true that 41% of the world population can vote next year in national elections. 41% in just 1 year. So democracy is always important, and pushing for it to be more inclusive is always important. But in the upcoming year, it's going to be even more important. And we know that LGBTIQ lives, we are being weaponized in a lot of places, being used to sow division. We want to counter that. We need to promote more inclusive democracies. For me, this is also about us expanding our toolbox. When I started as an activist, a lot of the framing of advancing human rights for LGBTIQ people was framed around HIV and AIDS. That was like our entry point. Then we very successfully, I think, introduced more human rights focused language. All of these things are very important, and they continue to be important. But we have to talk about inclusive development as a whole. We have to talk about how to make our economies more inclusive, how to make our democracy more inclusive. And that is something that we need to speak to leaders with power, but we also need to talk about it within our own movement so that we have the tools that we need to make the advances that we need. And then our final, the final piece of today's panels that we'll be discussing is, of course, funding. Because we know that those who oppose our rights, they have more money than we do, and they use it. And we need to talk about how can we convince more donors to invest in our global movement, to complement all the creativity, all the passion, all the know-how, all the expertise that we have. I don't think it's a race about just the money. It's like we can't focus solely on that and say, well, we can't win if we don't have more money. That is not true. We can win because our lives are on the line. We're going to fight. We're going to use all of our passion, all of our know-how, all of our skills to advance our rights. But it's no doubt, of course, we want to convince more funders to come on board. And so these are the topics that we're covering today because they are critical for our movements at the moment. And that's why we're bringing together voices literally from around the world. I'm so grateful to every one of our speakers who have traveled very far to be here today. I'm grateful to everyone who's joining online or watching this afterwards who are part of our global movements, because that's the only way that we can succeed, by coming together. And that's what OutSummit is all about. So thank you everyone for joining us. Super happy to have you here. Please engage throughout the day with the questions in the breaks. If you're online, you can chat. If you're in the room, obviously we'll all run around over coffee or tea and discuss. Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you so much, Maria, for outlining the day's events, why they're so important, and thank you also for your leadership of Outright as we all struggle to deal with these forces that you have just mentioned. When Outright held our first OutSummit in 2015 in New York, we were hosted by the CUNY School of Law and the Sorensen Institute for International Peace and Justice in New York. And for the next coming years, CUNY shared its space with us every year and gave us a warm welcome for our annual event. Even though we've moved to DC this year, we're very happy that CUNY has stayed with us as a co-sponsor of OutSummit. And we'd like to share a brief video message from Sudha Setty, the Dean of CUNY School of Law.
Privilege for us to be co-sponsoring this convening and to welcome you to OutSummit and to thank you for the partnership with Outright. This partnership supports the education of future social justice lawyers and speaks firmly to the law school's mission to teach, learn, and practice law in the service of human needs. We express our support and our gratitude for the work that each of you do as human rights activists, community leaders, journalists, academics, and diplomats. CUNY Law is the premier public interest law school in the nation, sending far more of our graduates into public interest work than any other law school in the country. We are also one of the most LGBTQIA-friendly campuses of law schools, and we are the most racially diverse law school in the United States. The work of ensuring that every human being be given the opportunity to express their identity fully, to belong fully, to participate fully, and to thrive is critically important and demands the participation, creativity, labor, and collaboration that all of us can bring to this endeavor. We consider it a core value of the law school to be joining you in the international movement for equality, justice, and belonging. As a comparativist myself, I am especially excited that this gathering recognizes both the universality of human rights and that the challenges that we all face can be surmounted only by working together on a global level. This too is central to the work of the law school, as we see through our new Institute for Gender, Law, and Transformative Peace, through the Sorensen Center for International Peace and Justice, through our Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic, and indeed in much of the work that our faculty does in and outside of the classroom. I want to offer special thanks to my colleagues who helped facilitate CUNY Law's role in this wonderful endeavor. And let me end by thanking all of you for what you do every day and what you bring to OutSummit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Dean Setty, to CUNY Law School, and for the support that we've continued to have from them throughout the years. I now have the pleasure of introducing Graeme Reid. Graeme is the UN independent expert on protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. He was just appointed by the UN Human Rights Council in October 2023. From 2011 through 2023, he was the director of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Rights Program at Human Rights Watch. Graeme was also the founding director of Gay and Lesbian Archives of South Africa, a researcher at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, and a lecturer in LGBT studies at Yale University. And he's an anthropologist by training. We are so excited that Graeme has been named the new independent expert. We're really looking forward to working with him as we did with his predecessor, Victor Madrigal-Borloz. And we're so happy to have you with us, Graeme, virtually. We would now like to welcome your remarks, followed by a little bit of time for questions from the audience.
Great. Thank you so much, Neela, for that introduction, and Maria for your opening remarks. I wish I could be with you in person, but at least technology allows me to see many familiar faces in the audience, so it doesn't feel quite so weird to be talking into my computer. Last week, the Russian Supreme Court designated the international LGBT movement as extremist. This has immediate and dire implications for human rights defenders within Russia. Individuals face up to 12 years in prison. Organizations already severely constrained are effectively disbanded with immediate effect. This, as we all know, is the culmination of years of targeting by the Russian state. We watched this train wreck happen in real time. But I want to dwell on it for a moment, as it is emblematic of what we as a movement are facing. It should be inconceivable that Russian President Vladimir Putin uses the defense of traditional values and the specter of LGBT rights as partial justification for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But that is precisely what he did. Issues related to gender and sexuality are front and center of geopolitical conflicts around the world. Attacks on LGBT rights are now standard fare for authoritarian leaders. Let us recall Putin's playbook. The gay propaganda law gained traction in 2013, at a time when Putin needed to consolidate a conservative support base domestically and reposition Russia internationally. The gay propaganda law became shorthand for so much more, as he took on the mantle of defending traditional values. The propaganda law was not that egregious as far as these laws go, an administrative offense with a fine. But the collateral damage of the law included an upsurge of violent attacks on LGBT people, and especially youth, and a chilling effect on organizations, teachers, therapists afraid of falling foul of the law. Websites were closed. Organizations curtailed their activities. And over time, attacks escalated. The constitutional ban on same-sex marriage in 2021, the rambling speech on the eve of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then, during the war, a law to make changing gender markers impossible and gender-affirming care unavailable, while the gay propaganda law was extended to all age groups. 17 LGBT groups were classified as foreign agents, and the Russian LGBT network, an umbrella group, was shuttered. So it starts with an attack on vulnerable minorities. Putin used the protection of children as justification for the propaganda law, a false and dangerous narrative. This fans social hostility, including violence, and it is used for very specific political purpose. A clampdown on civil society groups ensues, and more repressive measures are taken, culminating last Thursday in the extremist designation. and this is 4 months ahead of Russia's presidential elections in March 2024. As Maria pointed out in the introductory remarks, is that elections are often a touch point for these kinds of attacks. Now, I recount these events that have unfolded over a decade as they echo elsewhere in the world, part of a routine, predictable playbook. LGBT people have been rhetorically designated as public enemies in Indonesia, Malaysia, Hungary, Kyrgyzstan, Egypt, Lebanon, Uganda, and Ghana, to name but a few. This has immediate consequence for individuals most directly affected: systematic discrimination, violence, and arrest. But the implications are so much bigger. Wherever I go, I hear variation on a theme: pushback, backlash, organized opposition, the anti-gender movement, different ways of speaking about the circumstances of this time. Words are lightning rods. In UN negotiations, the term gender causes a kerfuffle, as does diversity or intersectionality, all on our red flag. The rights of LGBT people are being cast by some as a threat to the already precarious multilateral global order. LGBT people have become a symbolic marker of a divided world. These are no ordinary times. How do we understand this moment? It's important to recognize that remarkable progress has been made, and what we are seeing today is organized opposition toward that progress. Progress has been uneven and inconsistent, but overall the trajectory has been positive. If we take decriminalization of same-sex conduct as one marker, 25 years ago, 106 countries criminalized. Today, 66 countries do. Legal gender recognition based on self-identification has been introduced in 22 countries. Legal recognition of relationships, be it marriage or civil unions, is available in 70 jurisdictions. Perhaps there's a generational gap in expectations, but certainly for me, these developments were completely unimaginable in my errant youth. So on a good day, I remind myself that the challenges we face are also a measure of just how far we have come in the last decades. And all of us can celebrate these accomplishments that have come about through sustained collective effort. But I am worried and deeply concerned. We are living in dangerous times, and I don't use that term lightly. The kind of rhetoric that singles out a particular group, that designates LGBT people as a threat to the social order, as a threat to tradition, culture, and religion. This rhetoric situates us as a symptom of excessive liberalism of the West, as an emblem of disruptive modernity, as a foreign influence. We have become the symbolic shorthand for a much deeper divide. And underlying this are different worldviews. One based on individual freedoms, bodily autonomy, and human rights, and another authoritarian, and where individual rights are curtailed by the moral majority. As the Eastern Caribbean Supreme Court noted in its judgment decriminalizing same-sex conduct in St. Nevis last year, public morality is not synonymous with religious dogma or public opinion. When one group is singled out as the root of all problems, it never ends well. Already we have seen this in violent outbursts in Norway, Georgia, the United States, Senegal, Cameroon, and Indonesia, to name a few. That is why a gathering like the OutSummit seems especially important now. Our strength lies in transnational solidarity. That is why Putin has identified the international movement as extremist. And our strength is in visibility. The OutSummit is one of the few opportunities to bring people together from all regions of the world, to share experience, to think, to strategize, and plot a way forward. And given the challenges we face, we need to be astute in thinking about new ways of taking this work forward. We need to think creatively and strategically. We need to think out of the box. We need to work on our specific issues while always keeping the big picture in mind. I'm talking to you from Johannesburg because I've been participating in a 3-day gathering with African parliamentarians, including from Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Kenya, and the Seychelles. This meeting left me with a profound sense of hope and optimism for the future. I was impressed by strategies that are flexible, context-specific, and pragmatic. As a member of parliament from Zimbabwe put it, don't isolate, but engage. Find opportunities for collaboration. Build networks. Engage diplomatically, not emotionally. Avoid a them and us approach. As UNDP conference organizer Monica Tabengwa noted in her closing remarks, these are people willing to put their necks on the block, to jeopardize their careers, because they are taking a stand for the universality and indivisibility of human rights. Almost all the parliamentarians are what we may call allies, but I hesitate to use that term, as we are all allies in a common cause standing up for fundamental human rights. It does seem to me that the situation we are in presents new opportunities, because this has become so much more than a minority rights issue. There's scope for deep alliance beyond the confines of a narrowly defined identity-based politics. Given the current climate and the nature of the opposition, we cannot afford to address our issues in isolation. Women's rights are a target. Refugees and other groups deemed socially undesirable or a threat to the social order are under attack. Freedom of the press, the independence of the judiciary, and the free operation of civil society is under threat. One of the many strengths of OutRight is that it was founded on the premise of human rights for all. Once again, I'm sorry that I'm not with you in person. I would like to be part of your deliberations and celebrations. Thank you, though, for the opportunity to speak from afar. I believe there's time for a couple of questions.
Thank you so much, Graeme. Thanks for being with us here from South Africa. And just as Graeme was speaking, before we get into Q&A, those of us who are sitting here in the physical room in Washington, D.C., I hope you're all aware that there are people in the chat commenting from Burkina Faso, from Ghana, from Uganda, from the Philippines, from Singapore. So as we're all seated here, this is truly a global conference, and it's great to have Graeme as our UN independent expert representing that, and to have all the people who are in the virtual space here with us today. So we now have about 5 minutes for questions before we move to our first panel. So please feel free to make your way to a microphone if you have a question, or if you need a floating mic, to please raise your hand and we will get one to you. Yes, would you, floating mic or? Thank you, June. We'll take about 3 questions, and then we'll have Graeme respond to all of them, and then we'll move on.
Hi, I'm Raja Nadeem from Pakistan, Wujud Society, and we work for gender minorities there in Pakistan, especially the transgender people, because we can't talk about LGBTI people there according to the Pakistani law. My question to Graeme would be that you just mentioned the independence of judiciary, in this context, that we can look forward for a better democracy and people can have more rights. So how, UN is influencing or facilitating the movement for the LGBTI community, especially talking about judiciary, because they are the one who make the decisions, and we are facing the same situation in Pakistan. So I would like you to, if you can put a shed light on this, that how independence of judiciary can be, molded, or how we can influence them or facilitate us for the cause.
Thank you so much, Nadeem. We can take another couple questions.
I'm Craig Conniff. I'm at UVA now, but originally from India, actually. So my question has to do with what you see as the basis for discrimination. So some people argue that there's a debate as to whether the discrimination that the LGBT community faces has to do with the enforcement of traditional gender roles, and that being the primary goal, versus there being an independent route of discrimination that attaches only to LGBT identity. And I'm curious as to how you see the interaction of that, in the various spaces where you see the discrimination occurring. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I see another question over here.
Hi, Graeme. Doug Kerr from Dignity Network Canada. Congratulations on your new role. I'm just wondering if you could also just say a few words about how you plan to develop your priorities over your mandate and next steps in terms of engaging with civil society. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
We have one more question, I think. Graeme, we have one more, and then we'll turn back to you.
Hi. I was wondering, you mentioned that the LGBTQ community has served as a symbol for a greater divide, and I'm wondering if you could expand on that idea, especially in connection to the question before this past question, and how we can unify among our own multifaceted community to bridge that divide for ourselves before others. And I'm Lila from Lesbian Global. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, Graeme, we're going to give you about 4 minutes to try to answer all those questions comprehensively.
Shall I put on a timer?
Yes, I have mine here.
Okay, very good. Look, I think in terms of the independence of the judiciary, what I was particularly focused on here is the way in which attacks on minorities, and often LGBT people, are used by authoritarian leaders as a precursor to other attacks on democratic institutions. So, for example, in Poland, there was the declaration of LGBT ideology-free zones, the creation of a specter of a threat to the social order, and then under that guise are attacks on the independence of the judiciary, on the freedom of the press, on civil society writ large. Or in Uganda, the kinds of restrictions that are placed on LGBT groups are then used as a pretext to clamp down on civil society in general. So these are the, so these are the kinds of issues that I was addressing today, is the way in which authoritarian leaders use this as a kind of pretext for other anti-democratic acts. In terms of the roots of discrimination, I think this is always context specific, and we need to focus on the particularities of circumstance in specific countries and specific issues in order to understand the roots of discrimination. I think what's interesting is the way in which this is manipulated by leaders for very particular political purpose, and often, as Maria said in her opening remarks, around election time. But I do think that there's common cause, certainly with the women's rights movement, and then that speaks to the underlying structures of patriarchy and the way in which that plays itself out in terms of discrimination against LGBT people and attacks on women's rights in general. Plans for the future. I've been in this role now for a month. I do have an idea for a first report, which would focus on freedom of expression, freedom of association, and freedom of peaceful assembly, because I feel that this is under sustained attack in various different parts of the world. And there's an urgency in terms of getting that report out, but there'll be a call for input going out very shortly. I am then going to be engaging with civil society to understand what the priorities and needs from civil society are, and see how those gel with what is possible in terms of the reports that would be produced over the next 3 years. How and why have LGBT people become a kind of shorthand for a range of other issues? I think that, I use the example of Putin because that's so clearly the way in which he has very cynically, I think, manipulated public hostility towards a vulnerable minority for very particular political ends. But I see this as a pattern that is echoed in various parts of the world. And the difficulty with that is often then, because it's a symbolic marker, we're not really talking about the thing itself. We're talking about the way in which that is used in broad geopolitical conflicts, and specifically to create a divide between the defenders of so-called traditional values and a kind of uniform West, which has been the kind of discourse that we've seen in Russia, for example. So I hope that answers the questions more or less.
Thank you so much, Graeme. And I just realized that I was negligent in going to the virtual, so I'm glad I can see the screen. Graeme, if you don't mind, I'm going to take one more question from our virtual audience. And I believe that Whitney has a question. Thank you, Whitney.
Is that on? Okay. We have a question from Stefan in the chat about the UN strategy for economic inclusion of LGBTQI plus people in the global South and global East.
Okay, well, coming from South Africa, I mean, this is front and center to my thinking, and certainly also through my work at Human Rights Watch, the direct correlation between economic vulnerability and susceptibility to human rights abuses is absolutely abundantly clear. And so I would hope that that is a focus throughout the reports and work that I do in my new role as independent expert.
Thank you so much, Graeme. Please, everyone, give a warm round of applause to Graeme.